That Scientology moment is really fascinating. I'd kind of put a post-it on it because you describe the representative of the Church of Scientology in his silver iridescent suit standing on the steps, right? And he's gesturing towards this group of kids who are wearing the anonymous V for Vendetta masks,
right,
which you flag as like the first time this mask appears in real life, right? Breaking through the screen into the outside world.
Right, yes.
And then there you are, equally kind of in some kind of role play, right? Because you have a notebook that says reporter's notebook on it, which you use to get past the police line.
Right.
So you can go and talk to the guy on the steps of the Scientology building who says, these are all terrorists. They're a terrorist organization. And we're protected by the First Amendment because we're a church or something like that, right?
Right.
Right.
Yes.
And then you go and talk to the kids, and the kids all give you inside joke trolling responses to any questions that you ask them. And so all of this is such a bizarre, surreal kind of postmodern moment of the internet making this incursion into the real world in this trollish kind of way. And yet it seems like we can draw lines from there, say, to Charlottesville and perhaps even to the Capitol insurrection in terms of this trollish organizing. How have you thought about that in hindsight?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was definitely a very weird moment where everyone was sort of lying to each other, where, the Scientology guy didn't know who these people were, really, where they were coming from. And he just automatically said that they were a terrorist organization. 4chan was lying about where it was from. It was saying, I'm from Newgrounds or some kids website. And I was never really, I wanted to be a reporter, wanted to be a writer. And so I just had a notebook that said reporter's notebook. And and even though all I knew was that I knew about 4chan, that's sort of all I knew. So I was really a user in a sense, going to interview other users. It was very strange. And yes, it I guess sort of like heralded this now common thing that happens where the internet leaks into real life, where Charlottesville much later on, when the alt-right spawned off 4chan, was also a manifestation of all these internet memes and ideas and conflicts that were happening online, kind of spilling out into real life. And it was sort of horrific when it happened, because obviously it didn't translate into real life, where a lot of these men thought they would look a certain way because they had been hyping themselves up with like nonsense fascist ideology online. And then they get there and they look ridiculous, right, when it comes into real life. And it's horrific as it sort of conflicts with like how it actually how they imagine they are and how it actually appears. So yeah, that's and now it's just sort of become a pattern where political movements coalesce this way, and then sort of the border between real life and the internet kind of gets effaced.
What's wild about it with Scientology is as an outsider who knew nothing about that online fringe kind of world at the time, I think to me, and certainly to a lot of people I knew, it seemed like Anonymous was this, sincere activist movement that was making a statement, right? And in some ways, they were choosing a sort of anti-corporate. There was an anti-corporate and anti sort of exploitation angle they were taking, and yet, seeing it from the angle that you give us access to, it's like, oh wow, this was sort of the ultimate trolling event of its time.
There was an expression, I don't think this made it in the book, but there was sort of a common expression among Anonymous that Anonymous was Anonymous's own worst enemy. So it was always sort of like tearing itself apart. So it started as this trolling movement and people who wanted to create mass pranks. And then when all these kids were networked together, all these sort of young men were like, oh, well, we're kind of bullies. What's the biggest bully we can find? At first, it's just a neo-Nazi online. Then they're like, oh, well, we defeated him. We outed him as FBI informant. Then they're like, well, Scientology, that's a big bully. Maybe we can mess with them. And then after that happens and does fairly well, they're like, well, what about major corporations? What about the military-industrial complex? They're like, those are those big power structures that all of us as hackers hate and as young rebellious men hate. And they make a sincere go at it. So then they do indeed become sincere, a lot of them sincere activists. And there's sort of a split between the old school trolls who are like, no, we're nihilists to the heart. We have no political agenda. And people are like, no, actually, I found agency in this. There's actually real power here. We can make an effect. So there was that conflict in the group. But yeah, Yeah. So it ultimately, what happened was that they were pretending at first, and then everyone believed them. So that mask became the face, right?
Yeah.
They realized that people, they said, "Oh, we're an international hacktivist collective that is millions strong, and a secret shadowy society that is very powerful." And people loved that story. So that gave them power, right? Even if it was just a bunch of message board.
Yeah, and so just the last thing here, because it's for me, it's so emblematic of the book, is that there's almost this realization that I see you painting in an anthropological way, that here's this new form of social experiment that reveals an enduring kind of human truth, right? That even if we're finding community through isolation and cruelty and helplessness and nihilism, somehow what evolves is a quest for meaning and power and agency and group identity, which is just, yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. That then, of course, spills over into the world, as you were just saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. That's a very nice takeaway. And I think, yeah, that's what I tried to kind of get across in the book when all of these sort of young men got together, even starting in the early 90s, right before 4chan, on Something Awful, and then on 4chan, they started from a place of sort of deep nihilism, where they're like, nothing matters. But that's sort of, you can't stay there long comfortably. It's like nature abhors a vacuum. It's that sort of idea where something needs, so they can only be nihilist for so long, and then suddenly they're back to like, well, how do we cobble together a value system? How do we kind of build something? Because being in a place of nothing actually is not comfortable. So you see them doing that over the years. So at first they sort of built this anarcho, kind of anarchist, anti-corporate, anti-power structure thing called Anonymous. And then the FBI, when that was effective to some degree, the FBI arrested all of the main figures. And then in the vacuum that followed, there was again a nihilism that then got built up into this sort of like the delusion of fascism, and sort of this like hatred towards modern society, or at least power structures, or at least this idea that maybe they should attack the power structures from the far right.
There's one more origin story question I want to ask, because it'll lead into, and I think unlock a lot of where we get to. And some of this is speculation on my end, but I would love to hear your idea behind it, because I don't think you touched upon this. But you do mention that in Japan, Japanese kids that were focused on academics did not understand how to play. And they would have all of these fantasies of murdering their father or going and killing people. And because they were so focused, we'll say, on STEM or STEAM sort of academia. And you paint a picture of people who, you keep referencing living in the mother's basement and such. But I wonder, this phenomenon of these people who collect, they obviously are not socially attuned, especially with Gamergate and the misogyny that was happening there. Now, I grew up being bullied, but I was also constantly playing sports and with people around me, even the bullies, and there was real contact that happened. And whatever happened, it still made me a pretty well-adjusted adult. But you mentioned at one point that it seemed like these people are just kids stuck in adult bodies when you're talking about gamers specifically. So there's psychological or social traits that you've picked up, especially spending so much time in these spaces. And do you think that there are some traits that persist when it spills out into the real world that kind of disassociates them from reality that most of us share?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think for sure, yes. I think this kind of became more clear after the book was written. That what happens if you spend a lot of time online is that you really depart from reality, that you can kind of believe more fantasy. You can construct a very delicate, elaborate fantasy world that as soon as it contacts reality, it starts to shatter like a sandcastle or something. But the longer you stay indoors and away from that, the more elaborate it can become.